So, chapter 5, The Snargets. I'll show you some artwork before I start as well. I'm not quite sure who they are. Oh, Edward Ardizone. He's, there's a couple of little illustrations dotted around. There's not very many, but there are a couple dotted around the book. So, chapter 5. Why don't you go out and get some fresh air, Barney dear? Asked Grandmother. Barney stood and looked out of the window. Doesn't look very fresh to me, he grunted. A yellow fog hung over the trees outside. The smoke from the back kitchen chimney stirred itself into it, and there seemed to be a smell of distant cement works. Never mind, my dear, it's better than stuffing indoors all day. All right, Granny, I'll go out. After about 20 minutes, he found his jersey mixed up with his bedclothes, one outdoor shoe under the bed and the other one under the chest in the hall. He wandered out into the garden. He was neither warm nor cold, and there was no wind at all. He made for the chalk pit, whistling, and with his hands in his pockets. Just going to mute my PC. As he came near the edge of the pit, he stopped whistling and stood still. There were voices coming from the bottom of the pit. His pit. Well, perhaps it wasn't his pit. It didn't even belong to a grandfather. Or did it? Perhaps holes in the ground didn't belong to anybody. All the same, he was quite annoyed that other people should be poking around the pit. He went cautiously to the edge and peeped over. Down there, among the tin cans and other rubbish, were 3 boys about his own age, maybe older, dressed in jerseys and trousers that were grubbier and more tattier than his own, and grey shoes and holes in the toes. They all had long, rather greasy hair. Barney recognised them. They were the Snarget boys, part of a large family who lived in an old house with tattered weatherboards and were always getting into trouble. At least, that's what the grown-up says. But who didn't get into trouble? The Snargets seemed to be building some sort of shack for themselves out of dead branches and old sheets of corrugated iron, with a lot of horseplay and cries of, "No, not that way, Clever, like this, see?" Barney crawled to a place where a twisted tree trunk grew from the very edge of the cliff, hid himself behind it, broke a handy-sized clod of clay and roots from the cliff edge, and hurled it at the roof of the shack. It curved through the air towards a target, but missed, and landed almost noiselessly on a mossy log. Barney chose himself another clod and threw it, but this time it stuck at the bottom of an upturned pail and exploded like a little bomb, scattering bits of clay over one of the Snargets. "'Ere, who's chucking dirt?" cried the first Snarget suspiciously. "I never," said another Snarget. "Must have been him," he added, pointing to the third and youngest. "Leave off, will you?" said the first Snarget, "or I'll do you, see?" "I never done nothing," protested the youngest Snarget. "Oh yeah, didn't you?" said the first. "No, I never." "Well, don't you do it again, that's all." At the top of the cliff, Barney, the cause of the trouble, chuckled to himself and broke another clod. This time his aim was true, and the clod landed fair and square on the sheet of the iron with the most satisfying clang. 3 Snarget heads popped out at once like ferrets out of a rabbit hole. "I told you someone was chucking dirt," said the first Snarget. "And I told you it wasn't me," said the youngest. They looked around, scowling at the floor of the pit. "All right, it's no use hiding. We can see you," called the eldest Snarget. Barney hugged himself in silence behind his tree trunk. He knew this was just a bluff. They hadn't even looked in his direction. "It's old Albert, I bet," said the middle-sized Snarget. "He's been following us." "We can see you, Albert," called the first Snarget. "Come out of that bush, or we'll come and do you." They were standing looking at the far end of the pit with their backs to Barney. With great care, Barney broke off as big as a clod as he could and aimed it again at the roof of the shack. It hit and exploded with another loud clang, scattering pieces all over the 3 Snargets, who ducked wildly and clutched at each other, and looked foolish at being taken by surprise. They whispered fiercely among themselves, pointing at places on the cliff edge. "Come on, come from behind us, did it?" "No, up there it is." "Don't be daft, he's up in them bushes. I tell you, I saw him." They all pointed to the cliff. "It's all right, Albert," called the eldest Snarget again. "It's no use hiding yourself up there. We're coming up to get you." But this didn't worry Barney either. By the time they got to the top, he could be well away. The Snargets must have thought this too, because they didn't make a move. They retired instead inside the rickety shack. Barney scored another direct hit, and a near miss. Heads popped out each time and looked around fiercely, but he was too well hidden, and they failed to spot him. But there seemed a lot of whispering going on in the shack, and then all three Snargets came out and started walking towards the way out. The eldest called over his shoulder in a casual voice, "Goodbye, Albert," and the other two repeated it. "We're going home now, Albert," called the eldest. "It's our dinner time, but listen here, Albert, we know you're up there. Just keep your hands off our shack, see? We got something in there that's valuable. We just dare you to meddle with it, that's all." The Snargets walked off towards the way out of the pit, whistling loudly and banging tins with sticks. Barney waited until he could hear the feet on the lane dying away. Funny, he thought, they've gone. Still, perhaps it is their dinner time. He came out from behind the tree and went round the edge of the pit to the low side, and walked along the bottom to the shack where the Snargets had built. He wondered what the valuable thing was that they had left in it. There didn't seem to be anything except a paper bag full of chestnut conkers. "Oh, silly old conkers," said Barney out loud. "They're not valuable." Perhaps they'd buried something. He dug around in the mossy floor and unearthed a very rusty tin box. It had writing on the outside. He could just make out the letters. "Gold block," it said. It felt very heavy. He ought to open it or not. He decided he would. There would be no harm in just looking. The hinged lid was rusted to the bottom, and it wouldn't move. He banged at it with a stone, and out fell a rusty mass of screws, nuts, bolts, and some curtain rings. Inside the lid of the box was more writing, which said that gold blocks was the finest pipe tobacco, made from choice Virginia leaf. Barney threw the tin away in disgust, and a voice said, "All right, mister, come out. We've got you covered." It was the Snargets. They'd played a trick on him and crept back. He came out of the shack and faced the Snargets. One had a broken down old air gun, and the others were pointing sticks. "Caw, it ain't Albert," exclaimed the youngest Snarget. "We can see that," said the oldest roughly. "What's your name?" he said to Barney in the same voice. "Barney," said Barney. "What's yours?" "I'm the Lone Ranger, and he's Robin Hood, and he's William Tell," snapped the eldest Snarget. "Golly!" exclaimed Barney. "Quiet!" snapped the first Snarget. "What was you doing in our shack?" "Yes, and what do you mean chucking dirt at us?" said the second Snarget. "Yes, and what you doing in the dump anyway?" piped the youngest fiercely. "Can if I want to," replied Barney, pretending not to mind. But he was not really feeling very comfortable. He was not sure just how rough these Snargets could get. "Can if he wants to, he says," exclaimed the Lone Ranger, as if he couldn't believe his ears. "What should we do with them, fellas?" "Tie him to a tree and shoot him full of arrows," suggested Robin Hood. "Put him in a dungeon and we'll leave him to rot," said William Tell. "No, I reckon we ought to lynch him on the spot. String him up," said the Lone Ranger masterfully. "We ain't got no rope," said Robin Hood. "We ain't got no bows and arrows," pointed William Tell. "Well, there certainly ain't no dungeon for miles around," said the Lone Ranger. "Let's just give him a bit of slow torture." "You wouldn't dare," said Barney, but he didn't feel too sure. "Oh, wouldn't we?" sneered the Lone Ranger. "That's what you think. We often do, don't we, fellas? Do it all the time, don't we? Give people with a slow torture." "Yes, and shoot them full of arrows," agreed Robin Hood. "And put them in dungeons," added William Tell. "I'd tell a policeman," said Barney stoutly. The eldest Snarget looked carefully around the pit. "Can't see no policeman here," he said. "I'd tell my granny, and she just lives up there," said Barney. The Snargets collapsed in howls of laughter. "He'd tell his granny," he says. "Hear that, fellas?" "He'd tell his granny," they cackled. Barney felt his face going red and tears coming to his eyes. Then he thought of something. "I'm going to tell Stig," he said calmly. The laughter went on. "He's going to tell Stig?" cackled the Snargets. But Barney just stood there and smiled, and the laughter gradually died down. "Who's Stig?" the eldest Snarget asked suspiciously. "Oh, it's just a friend of mine," replied Barney airily. "Garn, there ain't no such person," said the second doubtfully. "Yes, there is, and he's my friend," said Barney. "Where's he live?" squeaked the smallest Snarget. "Here," said Barney. "Here?" chorused the Snarget scornfully. "What, in the dump?" jeered the eldest Snarget, and he laughed as if he had made a joke. "Yes," said Barney. "Didn't you know?" "Go on. You can't tell half them," said the second. "What's he do? Tell us that then." He makes bows out of television aerials and arrows out of bits of flint, replied Barney. The Snargets gaped at him with open mouths. Look here, said the eldest at last. This here Stig of yours, what is he then, a boy or a man? Barney had to think a little before he answered. He's a caveman, he said. At once the Snargets burst into jeers and laughter again. Ah, you soppy old caveman. He's got out of the school book. He's pulling our legs, making out he knows a caveman. Come on, fellas, let's do him. Slow torture, they cried. But Barney leapt off the pile of rubble he was standing on and set off to run towards the other end of the pit. The Snargets were after him with shrill cries. He's off! Get him, fellas! Yeah, chicken! Run away, will you? Barney jumped fallen tree trunks and burst through the banks of nettles without caring for the stings. He knew the bottom of the pit better than the Snargets, and he seemed to be leaving them behind. Then he heard the voice of the eldest. Take it easy, fellas. He can't get out this end of the pit. Spread out so we don't double back. But Barney did not mean to double back, as quietly as he could, so that the pursuers could not hear him through the nettle banks and the elder trees. He made for the entrance to Stig's den, flung himself through the low doorway and collapsed, puffing and blowing, and pleased with himself, on the floor of the cave. Stig was there, busy making himself a really horrible-looking club out of a tree root, into which he was fixing bits of flint, broken glass, and rusty nails. Hello, Stig, panted Barney. I'm jolly glad to see you. But when he saw the horrible club, he began to feel almost sorry for the Snargets. He couldn't set this monster onto three little boys who hadn't really done anything to him yet. It may have only been a game after all. You never could tell with the Snargets. Barney just smiled uncertainly at Stig, and Stig returned him a friendly grin. Then from outside came the sound of the Snargets calling to each other. Ah, he's gone back your way, Ted. No, he ain't. I ain't seen him. Must be hiding round here somewheres. There were sounds of the undergrowth being beaten and stones being flung into bramble patches. Stig listened and looked at Barney suspiciously, but Barney made signs to be quiet. "Caw, wait till I get my hands on you, Mr. Barney, wherever you are," came the voice of the elder Snarget. "I'm all nettle stings one side of my face. We'll roll him in the needles when we get him. That's what we'll do." He sounded as if he meant it, and Barney felt as he was not quite sorry for the Snargets. Footsteps crackling on dry twigs sounded close to the den. Barney moved further back into the cave and made signs to Stig to do the same, but Stig stayed near the entrance, bristling. Suddenly the voice of the youngest Snarget piped up excitedly. "There's a hole here. A hole. Come out of it." And a large lump of chalk came flying through the entrance and hit Stig smack on the side of the head. Stig gave one roar and charged out of his doorway. Barney threw himself after him to see what would happen. The youngest Snarget gave one pop-eyed, disbelieving look at Stig and turned and fled, sobbing and screaming. "Ah! It's a caveman!" The other Snargets, who had been closing in when they had heard the youngest cry of discovery, saw Stig and turned and ran too. "Wait for me! Don't leave me!" wailed the youngest, and then they uttered a shrill of screaming terror, as if he put his foot through the bottom of a rusty enamel basin and fell headlong. "Help! He's got me! He's got me!" Almost as alarmed as the young Snarget, Barney ran up to where Stig was standing over the boy, who was shivering and moaning with fright, as he looked as if he expected to be eaten on the spot. But Stig was standing there looking down at the fallen William Tell Snarget with an utmost fatherly look in his eyes. He bent down to help the boy to his feet, and the Snarget moaned feebly. "Don't! Don't!" Then, seeing Barney approaching, he turned his eyes pitifully towards Barney and wailed, "Don't let him hurt me! Don't let him hurt me! I wasn't going to do no harm." But Stig kept hold of him and led him firmly and gently towards the den. The Snarget gang, troublemakers though they were not as black as they were painted. Anyway, they weren't the men to abandon one of their number to his fate, and perhaps too they had the idea that violence was not always the way to get things done. Stig, Barney, and their captive had not been long inside the den before there came a sound of hesitant footsteps from nearby. Barney looked out, and there were two other Snargets standing meekly together, unarmed and holding paper packets in their hands. The middle brother also had a handkerchief, which might have been supposed to be white, tied to the end of a stick. "We got gifts," said the one with the white flag. "Yes," said the other. "We come for a little 'un." Barney hesitated, "You better come in," he said, "but no tricks." "Not likely," said the middle Snarget. "Not with that there pal of yours about." They came in through the doorway, saw Stig for the first time up close, and stopped, their eyes growing rounder and rounder. Then the second of them took a step forward, gingerly, holding out his hand with a paper bag on it. "For you," he said in a shaky voice. "It's jelly babies." Stig took the little bag in a puzzled manner, squeezed it and smelt it, turned about in his hands. Barney realized that though he was clever at lots of things, he was sometimes surprisingly ignorant about such things as paper bags. Then, as he turned the bag in his hairy hands, one jelly baby fell out onto the floor. Stig's eyes widened, and he stooped down to pick it up, and held it to the light of the lamp which was flaming in the back of the cave, with a pleased expression on his face. Then he reverently stood the little sweetmeat in the niche in the chalk, and stood and looked at it. "You're supposed to eat it, Stig," said Barney, getting rather tired of this pantomime. "It's delicious." He went across to the jelly baby's little niche and popped it into his own mouth. Stig looked horrified, and Barney was afraid for a moment he was going to hit him. "There's more in the bag, Stig," he said hurriedly, and he took the bag from Stig and opened it and showed him the other little jelly figures. "Go on, eat one," he urged. Stig took one between his finger and thumb, put it slowly in his mouth, and also chewed slowly. Barney and Snargets watched anxiously. Then a smile slowly began to spread over his face. The Snargets, who had been standing there strained and tensed, sighed with relief and smiled too. Somehow, everyone felt as though some very solemn ceremony had been performed. Barney handed around the bag, and all 5 of them solemnly ate jelly babies. Then the middle Snarget produced a second gift, which was little bags of fizzy sherbet with hollow sticks of licorice stuck in them to suck through. They sat down to this. After a little instruction, Stig got the idea of how to suck the fizzy powder up through the little tube. But as soon as he got a mouthful and felt the unusual sensation on his tongue, he jumped up with an alarmed expression on his face and began coughing and spluttering, and the Snargets weren't sure whether to laugh or be alarmed. But Barney banged the stick on the back, which impressed the Snargets even more, and managed to soothe them down again. Finally, with a flourish, the eldest Snarget produced a packet of Woodbine cigarettes and handed them around. All 3 Snargets took one as if it was quite a usual thing, but this time it was Barney's turn to hesitate and wonder whether he should. As if he wished to show they were all friends now, Stig took one, beaming, and without even looking to see what the others were doing with theirs, he put it in his mouth. The smallest Snarget suddenly exclaimed, "Here, he's eaten it!" And before they could do anything, Stig had chewed up a little tube of tobacco and swallowed it with great satisfaction. The Snargets and Barney lit their cigarettes at the lamp. Barney immediately choked on his and threw it away, and decided he didn't like smoking. The smallest Snarget puffed away and turned first white and then green, and the other 2 smoked away quite happily. But Stig, though he ate another one, could not be persuaded to send up in the smoke what he considered to be nourishing food. The Snargets began to feel at home. "He's all right, your pal Stig," said the eldest Snarget to Barney. "He don't say much though, does he? Don't speak English." "Smashing place he's got here and all," said the second. "God, look at them old spears." "I really feared of him," piped up the youngest. "I weren't really feared of him," piped up the youngest. "I was just making out I was." "Yes, nor we really going to do no harm to old Barney here, was we, fellas? It were just make-believe, weren't it? Reckon old Barney and his pal Stig are all right, fellas?" The others agreed in chorus. Barney felt a warm feeling inside now that the Snargets reckoned he and his friend Stig were all right. "I tell you what," went on the eldest Snarget, "Stig and Barney will be a part of our gang from now on, and we'll swear an oath we won't none of us tell no one about this here den." Barney was going to agree, and then he thought, well, it was his secret first anyway, so why should he swear about it with anybody? But the Snargets swore a horrible little oath among themselves over the body of the last jelly baby in the bag, which they then cut the head off and buried to show what would happen to any of them who broke the oath. Barney felt fairly sure that his secret would not spread around the village now, and he felt somehow that Stig and the Snargets would get along very well. Barney was quite surprised when he got back to his grandmother's house to find that he was in good time for lunch, and Granny was just dishing up the dumplings. "Did you find something to do outside, dear?" asked Grandmother. "Not a very nice day." "I had super fun with the Snargets, Granny. First I bombed them, and they were going to lynch me or torture me or something, but I got away to Stig's den, and they thought Stig was going to eat one of them, but we ate babies instead. You know, the jelly ones." "Oh, Oh," said Granny. Aren't the Sniggets rather rough boys for you to play with?" "Yes, but they're not nearly as rough as Stig. I reckon they're all right," said Barney. Chapter 6. Good drink. I'm glad you're enjoying it, Louise. It's good. Yeah, Tash, my internet connection died out for some bizarre reason. Good to see you back. Hope you're enjoying Stig of the Dump. We're on chapter 6. Little illustration for you to go there. Skimmed and Buried is the next chapter. So, chapter 6, Stig of the Dump. Barney was up the elm tree. It was the one that grew very close to Grandmother's house. It had a swing on one of the lower branches, and near the top there was a hole where the jackdaws usually made a nest each year. Barney had climbed up to see how they were getting on this spring, and they had already laid one egg. He climbed higher among the springy branches at the top, and clung there, and let the wind blow him to and fro. He could see the house almost below him, and the garden with a few daffodils and crocuses showing, and the wood and copses where the trees still showed their bones but were beginning to cover them with new green leaves. He heard Lou's voice somewhere about the house calling for him, but he didn't answer. "I bet she can't find me," he thought, and grinned to himself. Then he saw his grandmother and Lou in the yard, going out to the car with shopping baskets. Grandmother called, "Barney, where are you?" Barney chuckled to himself. He could see them, so they could see him if they really looked. But Grandmother and Lou got into the car and drove off, and he could see it going away along the lanes towards the village. They'd gone off shopping and left him. It wasn't fair. He was so cross, he nearly fell off his branch. Then he thought it was no good trying to stamp your feet when you're wedged in the fork of a branch, and anyhow, he might as well stay up here instead of going shopping. He'd really rather be up in a tree in the wind than go shopping. He could see the ploughed fields with the tractor crawling over the bare earth, pulling the harrow. He could see the black and white cows on the pasture. He could see the chicken houses, and those very, very small bits of yellow like grains of sand running about must be the baby chicks. He could see a big black car coming along the lane towards the house. That was funny. He had stopped and pulled off the road into the copse near the chalk pit. He could see two men get out and walk towards the house. They wore dark hats and macintoshes, and didn't look like the country people. Had he seen them before? Yes, he had. He had come to the door more than once before, and he had answered the doorbell. They asked him if his grandmother got any silver or jewels to sell, and he had told them, of course, Grandmother had lots of silver and jewels, but he didn't think that she would want to sell them, as she'd got some money already. And then Grandmother had to come out and told them that she didn't want to sell anything, thank you, and if she did, she would sell it on the doorstep, and she seemed quite cross. And now the men were coming back again. Well, there was nobody at home, and he was going to stay in his tree. One of the men stayed in a lane, and of course the other went and knocked on the door. But of course nobody answered. The man knocked again and waited a long time. Then he went round to the back door and tried that. It wasn't locked. The man looked about him, opened the door, and went in. Barney's heart fluttered, and the legs felt funny as he'd nearly fallen off his branch. Though he was clinging on with all his might, that man had gone into Granny's house when he shouldn't have. He must be a thief. He would take all the silver and drive off with it in his car, and Barney was all alone up in the tree, and he thought he could see the countryside for miles around. He couldn't see a human being except the tractor driver fields and fields away. There was no one who could help him in time. Yes, there was. Barney started climbing down, trying not to be too shaky and excited. He had to go down to the side of the tree that was away from the house, so he couldn't be seen, and the best handholds and footholds were on the house side. Barney slipped and slithered the last bit, and landed amongst the bushy twigs that grew out of the bottom of the trunk. He crouched there for a few moments, hoping he had not made too much noise. Then he crawled out and ran as hard as he could across the paddock towards the copse. He scrambled over the fence and lay among the brambles there, panting and looking towards the house. He could see no signs of anyone coming after him, so he got up and plunged through the copse. Look out! Bluebells and primroses, he thought. I'm in a hurry. By the time he had got down to the pit and along to the bottom to Stig's cave, he was quite out of breath. Stig was there all right. There was a strong smell coming from something gluey he was melting on the fire. He was sticking arrowheads onto the shafts by binding them with catgut, which he was taking from a broken old tennis racket. He looked all ready for the spring hunting season. Stig, puffed Barney, thank goodness you're here. You've got to help. A man's got into Granny's house, and I'm sure there's a thief, and he'll take all the silver and jewels, and even my money box if he finds it, and there's got to be 3 threepence in there. What are we going to do, Stig? Stig just grinned in a friendly way, and Barney began to feel hopeless. It was just like when he was trying to explain about Stig to the grown-ups. They just smiled and said, really? And that, of course, Stig didn't speak any English. He didn't talk at all. He didn't talk all that much. But he must make him understand. Enemy, said Barney fiercely, pointing towards the top of the cliff. Bad men, he said, screwing up his face and looking wicked. Fight him, Stig. Shoot him. See him off, Stig, he urged, making a bow and arrow movements and spear movements with his arms. Stig seemed to get the idea. He grinned more than ever, and he scowled horribly at the same time. Barney looked around for weapons. Leaning against the wall were a few new-looking bows and arrows that Stig had been making, some spears, an axe, and a horrible-looking club. Barney picked up the bow and arrows and handed them to Stig. But Stig gave them back to him, and he took the club instead. Can I really have the bow and arrows, Stig? Exclaimed Barney. Gosh, thanks. Come on, we've got to be quick. They ran out of the far end of the pit, and instead of turning right and coming back through the copse to the garden, Barney led the way around to the house lane and up the hill towards the house. There at the top, where the lane passed near the chalk cliff, and there was a gap where the lorries backed off the road to dump things over the cliff, they found the big black car parked. And there, coming along the lane, were the 2 men in raincoats and dark hats, carrying a large suitcase. Without thinking, Barney fitted an arrow into the bow and shot it. The dark city hat flipped off the head of one of the men and was pinned to the bank of the lane by a flint-tipped arrow. The men stopped, and then they saw Barney. Now then, kid, said the man, cut it out. That's dangerous playing with bows and arrows. You're thieves, said Barney. I know you've got Granny's silver in that suitcase. The man looked at his companion. Hear that, he said. The kids thinks we're thieves. Look, sonny, we've come to look at your Granny's television, didn't we, Sidney? We got our tools in these here cases, haven't we, Sidney? That's right, said Sidney. Plucky little nipper, though, ain't he, Sidney? Looking after his Granny's house where she's away. Eh, sonny? I got some toffees for you in the car. I don't like toffees, said Barney. But he was beginning to feel foolish, and he lowered his bow, which was pointing at the man with another arrow fitted. The man turned around for his hat, which had an arrow struck through it. He pulled the arrow out and looked at the sharp flint tip, and his face went white. You little horror, he snarled at Barney. Where'd you get them things from, eh? You know you might have killed me. He broke the arrow across twice and threw it the pieces angrily to the ground. Come on, he said, and hand over the rest of those things, or there'll be trouble. He came towards Barney with a very nasty expression on his face. Stig had been lurking behind the car, listening to the strange talking and wondering what it was all about. When he saw the man break his precious arrow and come angrily towards Barney, it was enough for him. He let out a sound that was something between a growl and a howl, and dashed at the man, raising his horrible club. The 2 men looked at this wild figure, dropped their suitcases and ran, with Stig in mad pursuit and Barney running after Stig. Stig, Stig, come back, shouted Barney. It's all a mistake. They're not bad men. They're not thieves. They came to mend the television. But it was no use. What did Stig know about a television? There was barbed wire fence at the top of the lane, and the men decided to get over it in the hope of escaping from Stig. As the second one scrambled over, his raincoat got caught in the wire. In a panic, he struggled out of the coat and ran over the field, leaving it on the fence. It was this that saved him from the teeth of Stig's club, because Stig stopped to look at the coat. It was as if he was not quite sure what part of himself the man had left behind. Barney caught up with him and took hold of his arm. Stig, you mustn't chase those men, Barney panted. I thought they were thieves, but they're not. They might tell a policeman and there'd be an awful lot of trouble. But Stig was looking at the coat. As he turned about it, there was a tinkling sound, and a whole lot of shining things fell out of the pocket onto the ground. Stig pounced on them with wide open eyes, picked them up and admired them, turning them towards the light. No, Stig, said Barney, you can't have them. They're only the man's teaspoons. I expect he was going to have a picnic. Hey, just a minute. Barney pulled Stig by the arm. Come on, he urged. We'd better go and look at those suitcases. They ran back down the lane to where the suitcases were lying. Barney opened one of them. Golly, he exclaimed, all Granny's spoons and forks and ladles and things, her jewels and trinkets from her dressing table, one pair of cufflinks belonging to Grandfather, and his own money box. He shook the money box. Did it still sound like 3 shillings and 3 pence? So they were thieves after all. What should he do now? They might come back to their big black car at any time and just drive away. How could he stop them? He ran to the car, opened the rear door and looked inside. Under some sacks there were more suitcases and bags that clanked when he felt them. Loot from other people's houses. Barney sat in the front seat and held the steering wheel. If only he could drive, he could take the car to the police. He took off the handbrake. At least he knew how to do that. And the car began to roll backwards towards the edge of the pit. In a panic, Barney opened the door and scrambled out, with the car still moving. Barney's mouth opened, and he held his middle as he watched the big black car move slowly towards the pit. There was a lurch as then another went over the edge. The car bumped down on its underneath. Perhaps it would stop now. But no, the edge of the chalk crumbled. The rear of the car settled lower. The front wheels rose slowly in the air, and with a horrible scraping and grinding, the whole car slid over the edge. There seemed to be quite a long time before Barney heard the crash as the car hit the bottom of the dump, but he felt too sick to look. When he opened his eyes, he saw Stig looking over the edge of the cliff, waving and pointing and grinning all over his face, as if it were some great animal that they had just hunted over the cliff, and he was looking forward to cutting up the meat. Then he was running off around the pit to get to the bottom. Barney remembered the suitcases and hurriedly hid them in a deep bramble patch before running off after Stig again. By the time he got to the car, which was lying on its back with its wheels in the air, Stig was already hard at work, skinning the leather off the seats and the carpets off the floors. Barney stood there helplessly watching. Stig obviously thought that anything thrown into his dump was for him to do what he liked with. But if the men came back and found them at it, then they would be very angry. Then he saw what they would have to do. He got up on the pile of rubbish at the foot of the cliff and started throwing things on top of the dead motor car. Old washtubs, bedsteads and bicycle frames. Stig soon got the idea. They were burying the animal to hide it from the enemy. Before long, the car was covered in bits and pieces, branches and moss. Then, as they worked, Stig suddenly froze into stillness and listened. Barney listened too. There were voices coming from the top of the cliff. Barney crept into the inside of the upturned car and beckoned Stig in too. They crouched on the ceiling, looking up at the seats and pedals, and listened. The voices of the 2 men came down from the top of the cliff. Well, it ain't here, is it? Go on, have a good look. All right then, it's gone. What do we do now? We've got a nice long walk. That's what we've got, mate. And if you don't like walking, you can run. You seem to like your running all right. Who likes running? You run too, didn't you? You started running first. Got windy because a couple of kids were playing Red Indians, so we've lost a lot, and it's all through you. I tell you, they wasn't kids. One wasn't anyways. What was it then? It was a thing, I tell you, an horrible thing. Out of that pit, I shouldn't wonder. Come on, let's get out of here. I tell you, I don't like this place. I'm getting back to town if I have to walk all the way. Barney smiled at Stig as the voices faded away. Stig grinned and shook his horrible club. Granny and Lou were back from shopping when Barney struggled in through the front gate carrying 2 heavy suitcases of silver. "Barney, what on earth have you been up to?" Granny exclaimed. "I've brought your spoons and forks back, Granny. You see, 2 men came to do the television. I mean, that's what they said. But they were thieves, really. And I was up the tree, but me and Stig chased them away. And I let their car go over into the chalk pit. And it's now there with all their treasure in it." "Well, you have been having fun," said Granny. "Now let's have tea, shall we? Lay the table, Lou, and Barney, go and wash your hands. Look at them." Lou started laying the table. "Where are the teaspoons, Granny?" she asked. "In the usual place, I suppose, dear," said Granny from the kitchen. Barney put his hand to his mouth. "No, they're not," said Granny. "They're hanging on the fence in Mr. Tickle's field." "What?" Granny exclaimed. "Really, Barney? That's naughty. You know you mustn't take the silver for games." "I didn't take them, Granny," Barney protested. "It was the television man, and Stig was running after him with a club, and I tried to stop him because I thought he wasn't a thief. But he took his coat off and left it hanging on the fence, and the spoons fell out. I thought he was going to have a picnic at first, but then I saw that they were yours. I'll go and fetch them," and so he ran out. When Barney got back, there was a policeman at the door talking to Granny. She looked worried. "What's this about thieves, Sonny?" asked the policeman. "Yes, I saw them up a tree. I was. And one of them went into the house, and I went to fetch my friend Stig. And me and Stig had a fight with them, and they ran away, and the teaspoons fell out, and the car was full of treasure." The policeman scratched his head. "Ah, no, a car, you say? Just where might this car be?" Barney stood on one leg. "Well, I thought I could perhaps drive it to the police station, but it went backwards over the cliff, and Stig thought it was dead and started skinning it, and then we buried it. But I couldn't help it, I promise." The policeman was trying to write all this down in his notebook, but when he got to the part about skinning and burying the car, he stopped writing and looked at Barney. "You wouldn't be making this up, would you, son?" he asked sternly. "I'm afraid my grandson has a very strong imagination," said Granny. "But I'm telling the truth, Granny, I promise," said Barney. "Perhaps the little boy would like to show me where this alleged treasure is, ma'am," suggested the policeman. Yes, yes," cried Barney. "It's just down the lane. Come on." And he took the policeman by the hand and pulled him through the front gate, down the lane, explaining as he went. "It's all in the bottom of the car, the treasure." Well, it's in the top of the car, I suppose, because the car's upside down in the bottom of the pit." He led away to the top of the cliff where the car had gone over and pointed. "It's down there," he said. The policeman looked over. "I can't see nothing," he said. "Of course not," explained Barney. "We buried it. Come down and see." The policeman looked more and more disbelieving. "Look, son," he said. "There's 3 houses been burgled in the district, and it's my job to catch the thieves and get the valuables back. And I haven't got a lot of time to waste. What about this treasure of yours?" "It's down there," Barney insisted. "I'll show it to you if you just come down." He led the way around the top of the pit to the way in. It was getting dark now, and the policeman took an electric torch from his pocket. They clambered over the heap of rubbish, and Barney moved aside the branches that hid the door of the upturned car. "In there," he said. The policeman shone his torch inside. There was a terrible mess of ripped leather, broken glass from the windows, scattered stuffing from the seats, and bare springs, but no sign of the treasure. The policeman sat down on an old washtub and took his helmet off. He looked quite like an ordinary man. "What's your name, son?" he asked, quite kindly. Barney told him. "Listen to me, young Barney," said the policeman. "When I was a youngster, I used to have what your granny calls a strong imagination too. I used to play cops and robbers, and I can tell you it was a lot more exciting and a lot more fun than being a real copper, which I am now. So I'm not blaming you, you understand? You imagined you had a fight with 2 robbers, see? You imagined that this bit of old junk that's been here for years and years was a car that went over the cliff. Isn't that it? You wasn't telling lies because you thought it was true. But that's it, isn't it? It never really happened, eh?" Barney stood there dumbly. If a grown-up said so, and such a kind grown-up, and policeman too, perhaps you could imagine fights with robbers and cars going off cliffs. Perhaps he just imagined Stig. He wasn't looking miserably into the darkness of the pit, and it was just about to nod his head and agree with all the policeman was saying when he saw in the far corner of the pit a flicker of light. It was Stig's den. He scrubbed away some tears that had got into his eyes and said firmly, "It did happen, and I know where the treasure is." And he went scampering away along the gloomy bottom of the pit towards the den. He knew his way pretty well now, even in the dark. But as he went, he kicked cans and rattled all sheets of iron as much as he could. He wanted to give Stig warning that they were coming. He felt it would be too much trying to explain Stig to the policeman, even if Stig was there in front of his eyes. He heard the policeman coming along behind him, making even more noise, and he was almost sure he heard a scuffle and a rustle. That was Stig hiding himself in his favourite bramble patch. When he got to the entrance of the den, well ahead of the policeman, there was no sign of Stig in the bright firelight inside. He stood by the entrance and waved the policeman in. The policeman doubled himself up, and he crawled through the low entrance, and then he gasped. It looked like Aladdin's cave. Necklaces and bracelets hung winking from the roof of the shelter. The floor of the cave was carpeted with the skin of the car seats. Stig's bed was made up with padding from seats and covered with fur coats, and above it, stuck to a wall, was a driving mirror and a set of switches and buttons saying headlights and wiper and heater. And all around the floor, stuck into the ground, was set out like tin soldiers on parade, were troops of silver spoons and forks. Stig had been enjoying himself. "Well, I'm blessed," exclaimed the policeman. He took out his notebook. "I take it all back, Barney, me boy, and if you'll just help me tick off in my book all this stolen property, which someone has so kindly put on parade for us, we'll get it back to the rightful owners all the quicker. And I shouldn't be surprised if there was a reward for a bright boy at the end of all of this." Barney started to explain all over again what had happened, but the policeman said he had a tiring day, and he'd rather not have to have any more explanations. But that time, when he got home from his grandmother's house, he took a brand new bicycle with him. And Stig was disappointed in not being allowed to keep all the treasure, but before he went, Barney found some spanners in the wreck of the car and taught Stig how to use them. Stig was very proud of his necklace of steel nuts strung on wire cable and his bangles of piston rings. And now we have it. Chapters 5 and 6 done.